Hi, I'm Frieda Vizel, and this is Radically Human.
This has been the biggest propaganda campaign I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like this. So we have been subject to that, but we still have agency.
For today's episode, I have a conversation with very, very insightful writer, analyst, commentator, Simon Elmer, whose work has very much influenced me. Simon is a writer and researcher. In 2001, he received his PhD in the history and theory of art and architecture from University College London. He has taught at the universities of London, Manchester, and Reading, and for 2 years was a visiting professor at the University of Michigan. In 2015, he co-founded Architects for Social Housing, ASH, for which he is Director of Research. Over the past year, he has published 2 collections of articles on the coronavirus crisis, COVID-19, Implementing the UK Biosecurity State, and Brave New World, Expanding the UK Biosecurity State through the winter of 2020 and 2021. The work of ASH can be accessed on their website, or you can follow Simon on Twitter, and I'll include links to those in the episode description. I recorded my conversation with Simon a couple of weeks ago, June 15 to be precise, and although things change really quickly in our current climate, the conversation we had on understanding the crisis of 2020-2021 is extremely, extremely relevant. It's been very helpful to me. I did have a bit of an issue with the quality of the recording itself, so I am including alongside the podcast a transcript of our conversation. Do have a listen. Welcome, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Frieda. Nice to speak to you. I'm a real fan of your podcast.
I will tell you, your installments on the UK biosecurity state, I've read a number of times, and there's a lot of nuggets there that have given me so much pause for thought, and we're so different than what you read elsewhere. So I really wanted to unpack them. And actually, I wanted to start by asking you about the term biosecurity, which you use a lot.
Yeah.
And I think we hear a lot of people saying we're in a digital dystopia, or what does the word mean to you?
It's a difficult one. The reason I used it, I guess, was from reading the works of Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher of, I guess, biosecurity. I read a number of his books maybe 10 years ago, actually, or longer, actually, when I was doing my doctorate, 20-odd years ago. And when this crisis, if you want to call it that for the moment, started again, I'm not quite sure how. Maybe I went back to his books, but also he started a kind of a blog of small commentaries on what was going on generally across the world, but specifically in Italy, which was the first place to really enter into a crisis in Europe. And he wrote these very short blogs. When he started using this, or started reusing or applying this term biosecurity to what was going on in Italy. And then I returned to his books, things like Homo Sacer, and started reading some more ones. And he uses the term a lot. And he takes it, I guess, from Michel Foucault, the French philosopher's idea about biopower. And he kind of develops that on. I guess very briefly to kind of gloss that, Foucault's concept of biopower was a way of not negating, but going beyond or adding to the Marxist critique of ideology. That is that the power is not limited to government, police, army, the economy, the law, but goes through discourses, if you like, particularly medical discourses. That's one of the focuses of Foucault's work, and certainly Agamben's.
What do you mean by discourse?
Discourse is ideas which have institutional support, I guess, in the very simple terms. So there is a discourse of race, for instance, in the 19th century, which had the support of various institutions, anthropological and also financial. There is a discourse of neoliberalism, if you like, to bring it up to the modern day, which is supported by lots of different institutions, the media and so on. So it's not just a set of ideas, it's ideas which have got institutional, financial, governmental backing and so on. And Foucault's one of his big contributions, I guess, to philosophy was that sometime, I'm not quite sure where, there's a lot of different debate about that power became about control of bodies, of human bodies. And Agamben and Foucault, but Agamben has kind of applied this to the coronavirus crisis. And one of the distinctions he makes, if I can get this right, is that rather than having a right to medical care in the crisis, we've now got an obligation to biosecurity. So our bodies no longer have, I fall ill, I go to the doctor, I've got a right, living in a liberal democracy, to have medical care. There's various rights around that. Now I have an obligation to submit myself and my body to the programs and technologies of the biosecurity of the state. Yeah. And this is kind of fundamentally change our status as citizens under law. So I found that a very, very persuasive way to understand what was going on. But it's not just a set of ideas or philosophical doctrines. The term, certainly in the UK, that's where my focus of research has been. The term has been used by the government very openly and by various medical bodies of the government. We have something called the Joint Biosecurity Centre. The joint refers to the fact that it has the authority of the UK government to do what it does, but it's actually run by, mostly financed by, private organisations. It's modelled on the UK's anti-terrorism organisation, which was about assessing the level of threat, of terrorist threat to UK citizens, people living in the UK. And it's taken this as a model. And at the beginning, and I think it still is, it is still run by people who are part of our kind of spies, really, people who work for MI5 and so on. And they've taken this as a kind of a model for looking at the threat presented to us by diseases, by viruses, and so on and so forth. So right from the beginning in the UK, the crisis has been put on a kind of a war footing. I mean, I think that's fairly universal across the world. I think in the US and UK, everyone's talked about this as a war on the virus and all that sort of rubbish. And the Joint Biosecurity Centre is not subject to debate by our parliament. It bypasses all democratic processes. It merely makes recommendations, very strong recommendations, to the government about whether we should be under lockdown, how much lockdown, what the degrees are, and so on and so forth. And nobody really knows how these decisions are made. In fact, nobody knows except the government, because their decisions are not subject to public scrutiny as well. And these basically have now determined this Joint Biosecurity Centre, which is a public-private coalition, if you like. Public only so far as it has the force of UK law behind it, but private in terms of its workings and who it is that makes these decisions, is now deciding on our absolute fundamental rights under lockdown restrictions. So Agamben, over the last quarter of a century, has been the philosopher of the use of emergency powers and biosecurity in the world. And of course, that's why over the last year and a half, he's been absolutely slaughtered and attacked by media, academia, and so on and so forth. So those are the kind of the two reasons, both kind of discursive, philosophical, if you like, but also the fact that this term was being used very, very openly by the organizations which had taken away our rights.
Just describe to us what your experience has been with this entire thing over the last year and a half. Did this take you by surprise in March? And what did you make of it throughout? What's been your philosophy?
When we went into the first lockdown in March, I straight away started kind of writing short articles and publishing them on our website. And they were very, very tentative. They were looking at the kind of fatality figures that were coming out of places like Italy, which we were told was where we were going to be in the UK within a month or 2 weeks or so on. I was looking at the kind of figures that were coming out of China, the kind of the epicenter of the viral spread. I was very, very struck right from the beginning by the level of fear-mongering that was going on in the media. And when I was looking at these figures, I was very, very struck that what I was seeing in them was not getting reported. So right from the very beginning, I was very suspicious of this. But I was also very tentative. You know, we were talking about the death of people. You have to be careful in making large claims or generalizations or judgments about it. But the more I read about this and the more I researched it, I became more and more suspicious. And eventually I kind of came out and started to say, there's something wrong going on here. I guess from my background with ASH, that's what we call Architects of Social Housing, I've done a lot of research into legislation. I've done a lot of research I kind of know how to get into government documents and read them. And it became very apparent very early on that there was an enormous amount of information which was absolutely crucial to the way the government was responding to this crisis, the way in which the government was developing it into a crisis, certainly with the help of the media, that wasn't being made available to the public. So at the very beginning, my attitude was just, let's get this information out here. Let's talk about this. Let's analyze it and say, well, hold on, what's actually going on here? So that kind of was the first few months. I think when I wrote this article called Manufacturing Consent, I started to look more and more at the role of the media, which had completely, I don't know if it's like this in the US, but in the UK, the national media, almost without exception, there are some honourable exceptions, have completely given up their role as the fifth estate to kind of hold to account, to hold the government to account, to hold power to account, to question and criticise, and has become purely in a way that I've never seen before. Not during the war in Iraq, not during anything, no event that we've gone through. Has become purely a propaganda arm of the government. I say that without any exaggeration at all. That was very concerning as well. But so I began to look at how we had been talked into this. And there was almost no opposition to it on the street. You know, I come out of a kind of what we used to call the housing movement in the UK, which is about, trying to expose and redress the enormous crisis of housing affordability in the UK, particularly in London, where I live. And there was almost no street protest at all. One of the things I've been, which I know I have as well, most kind of appalled and shocked and surprised by, is that the various organizations which I would usually consider my allies in various left-wing or socialist or anarchist or communist or whatever you want to call them, or all of those organizations had almost universally come down on the side of this extremely right-wing government that we had voted into power in December 2019, the government of Boris Johnson. And the polarization of response to this, of ways of understanding what on earth is going on.
Yeah. Because
we've got an extreme right-wing government, the left saw that the only thing it could do was to kind of outdo it, if you like. What we call the Labour Party here, something like the equivalent of the Democrats in the US, was to sort of call for longer lockdowns, for harsher measures, for more punitive punishments of anyone who broke lockdown laws and so on and so forth. And I found this absolutely kind of incredible. I still do. It's definitely one of the shocks. So now, to try and finish off answering the question a little bit, since the spring, we're still officially under lockdown in the UK because extended yesterday by a further 4 weeks minimum. In the spring, I think there's been a kind of a build-up of just a lot of people just don't believe what's going on. And there's also an enormous amount of suffering from people who are suffering the effects of lockdown. People who've lost their jobs, people who are terrified about the vaccination program, which is now getting around to their children. There's a lot of terror about that, fear about that. And also the so-called vaccine passports, which has been put on hold for the moment, but which I believe is the ultimate kind of aim of all this. So there has been a growing opposition to this, and I'm very, very happy to say that since, when did it start? In March of 2021, and going on now, we've had, I think, 5 very, very large and getting bigger demonstrations, sometimes across the country, and sometimes linked up to demonstrations across the world, but particularly in London, we've had enormous ones. We've had 2 demonstrations and marches, which had something like 500,000 people in each of them. So there's a bit of hope in me now, but it's only with the people marching, because every other institution in the UK, education, we expect media, but the legal profession, the education, the medical, obviously the police and security, have completely collaborated with this vast deception and also collaborated in its implementation, or its imposition on the people of the UK. So that's kind of where we are now, I guess, to give you a sort of short response.
Are you feeling optimistic about the power of these marches? Do you think they move the needle?
No. I've been on too many marches and demonstrations over the last, decade or whatever. There are some good things about them. First of all, they're immense. They're bigger than anything I've ever seen in this country. They're absolutely huge.
Bigger than Iraq?
Yeah. Well, there was one anti-Iraq march which was claimed to have 1 million people on it. They're of that kind of size, but there's been 2, and the next one's going to get bigger. They're kind of growing. And the demonstration against Iraq had really huge support of the media, of papers, of kind of liberal papers. It had the support of various parliamentary parties and so on. These marches that we're doing, we're being opposed by everyone. We have no support, no representation in Parliament. The media either completely backs it out or denigrates this as a few hundred, right-wing conspiracy theorists. It's opposed by almost everyone, except the people on the street. And that's something I like about it. The fact that it hasn't been branded by a political party. It hasn't been branded by the left. It hasn't been branded by identity politics. It hasn't been branded by all the usual things that usually come in and grab this. The question facing us, though, is how we get this huge number of people. The UK is a pretty depoliticized country. And after all the sort of 3 or 4 years of Brexit, everyone had really had enough. And yet there's an enormous amount of people coming out, and rightly so, onto the streets. How we turn that into political power, which will change this, is something which we're all going to have to address and confront with over the next few years if we're not going to go into a permanent biosecurity state.
Do you think When I see from my perspective from here in New York, the kinds of turnouts over there, and we can hardly get a couple of hundred people here in New York City, even though to go to school in New York City, the children are tested repeatedly. They have to wear masks. They are mostly virtual, and they are introducing, our state has partnered with all the big tech companies to introduce all of these programs that will slowly engulf every aspect of life, which I find very, very concerning. And yet we can't get more than a handful of people to come out.
Is that just in New York, or is it across the US? Are there any? Because I'm kind of surprised. I'm maybe not so surprised by New York, which has changed as a city, hasn't it, over the last 10, 20 years or something. But are you getting big marches elsewhere in the US, in other sort of cities?
I don't think so. I don't think we're getting big marches elsewhere. And this is, I guess, my question, because I don't think we're being pushed in the same way. We have a lot of private schools. We have a lot of private institutions. And for those with money, there's always an alternative. So I think the pendulum doesn't swing as far as it seems to swing in, for instance, the UK. We don't have that heavy-handed restriction. I don't know. Maybe that is a part of it, or maybe it's cultural. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say because, a few months ago, I was kind of looking at Germany, Berlin, where they had, Berlin always likes a good protest, huge marches. In Italy, in other kind of countries across Europe, particularly sort of Eastern Europe and stuff, there were enormous marches where they had really, really, really severe restrictions from the government. And I was kind of waiting, and I was like, God, is the UK ever going to have a response? And strangely, it's kind of happened this spring. Before that, there was really absolutely nothing for almost a year. A few kind of brave, kind of small groups of people. But now it's kind of rising up, and I hope it does continue on. It's very hard to say when a population kind of cracks, not to undermine the seriousness of what's going on. The UK is a very climate-led population because our winters are so bloody miserable, and we're having a nice sunny spring and summer and stuff. So, people are out on the street. They're sort of enjoying getting out and doing that. The question is, are we going to continue this when we go into the autumn and the winter and so on and so forth?
It's easy now to go out. The spirit is, you grab your stuff, you stay outside. You're not standing in the freezing rain.
It shouldn't be like that, but that is the truth.
Yeah, well, I don't blame anyone, we understand that, especially it gets very uncomfortable.
It's not just that. The other thing is, as I said before, I think there are two things which have really defined these so-called anti-lockdown protests. They haven't actually been primarily about anti-lockdown. They've really been about the vaccination program over here, which is really being pushed hard. It is absolutely everywhere. It pops up all the time on your laptop. Of course, it's all over the bus stops and stuff like that. It's on adverts on TV. Every time you write something which uses one of the kind of key words on your computer, something will come up kind of promoting it. It's being pushed enormously hard. And one of the things I do is I keep a record of the adverse drug reactions to these experimental DNA-based gene therapies, if you want to call them that. One thing's for sure, they're definitely not vaccines because they're not stopping
transmission or...
Yeah, well, they certainly don't seem to be massively reducing positive tests with RT-PCR tests, which themselves are deeply flawed. And you're constantly hearing about people who got vaccinated, took a Pfizer vaccine and then tested positive afterwards. So, there's a large number of people who have died. Again, none of this is being reported in our press. So there's an awareness of that. But I think the really big thing is we're getting to our children. And there are a lot of mothers, not only mothers, obviously, but particularly on the marches, there is a very large contingent of women out there who are really scared and very, very angry that their children, when they go to school, first of all, already being forced into wearing masks, which is having an enormous damaging, negative psychological effect on children. There's lots of documentation on that. But also, under threat constantly of vaccination. The laws are constantly being changed so that a child, I think the age of consent has been kind of reduced enormously. There's been declarations that if the child doesn't actively say no, these NHS, National Health Service workers will take that as a yes and inject the child. And there's a lot of families who are very, very scared and very, very opposed to that. And I think that's one of the things, because we're getting to the children now. We're not quite there. We're still on because it's, I guess, like in the US, the vaccination started with the most elderly and has gone down kind of periods of 5 years or something. I think it's still in the young 20s now. And if it gets to children, there's a real resistance to that. So I think it's not just the weather, it is the seriousness of the real fear of what that's going to do.
When they start to vaccinate children. They've been vaccinating children here for months now.
Really? Goodness.
Oh, yeah. And they actually, in New York City, have brought vaccination centers in, I think, 4 high schools for a start. It's a pilot program. And they're going to, what they hope to do is spread it to all the high schools, and what they'll count as consent, who knows?
Yeah, it's very, very worrying.
Yeah.
It's very worrying that anyone would take these experimental vaccines, which actually aren't vaccines. They're biotechnology which have never been used on humans before. Certainly the Pfizer, the Moderna ones. The AstraZeneca one has got a appalling kind of record of the damage it's doing to people, including death.
Yeah.
Also very, very serious reactions and stuff, which you just, if you're like us, we kind of dig into this, you can read about it. But again, you don't read about it in the big press, in the mainstream press. And the really scary thing is there's so much fear-mongering out there and there's so much exaggerations and stuff. I really try and keep my research to the facts and to the analysis of those. And when I present these, we've got to the point after 15 months or something, people just don't want to know. They just want to take the vax, as they call it, and move on with their life. Because this is how it's been presented. I'm sure it's the same over there. The UK government has said, the vaccine is our route back to freedom, which has got so many things wrong about that statement. But that's kind of the framework in which people understand this. Lots of people that I know, people who live in the block that we live in, but also friends and stuff, have kind of just sort of said, I don't want to know. I just want to take the vaccine and get back to this normal life. Yesterday, the government didn't announce it to Parliament, they announced it to the press, that the lockdown, which they've been promising since last November, the relief of lockdown rather, is going to get continued on. And I think people are now beginning to think, well, if it goes to July, then you've got 1 month of summer left, and then when we go into autumn, everyone's going to get the flu again, and well, we're going to be locked down again. And I think people are beginning to, even those who are most committed to this, the COVID faithful, as I call them, are beginning to think, maybe this is the future, this is it. I mean, our Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, who's really been the kind of the dreaded figurehead, the kind of the face of announcing these, this eternal lockdown, has basically said, we're going to be living with this virus forever and people will die from it. But he's also said, we're basically going to be living with lockdown forever. And, this is what I've been, and many other people have been predicting, that this is not a transient thing. This is not about locking down, getting healthy, getting vaccinated and moving on. This is a new paradigm of government, which is going to be universal, certainly in formerly Western democracies, and therefore represents a fundamental shift in our world and the way that certainly those of us who live in the formerly liberal democracies are going to live our lives.
So how do you understand why? Why extend lockdowns? I mean, we're going on 15 months, as you said. And of course, a lot of people have had different explanations for what's going on. But I think you've put together a lot of us found very compelling the way you explained what was going on. So maybe you can summarize here some of that.
Let's start with one thing. One of the things that really struck me, because I consider myself, I'm kind of trained as an art historian, but I'm kind of a historian, is that right from the very beginning, there was a discourse, again, to use that term, that what we were facing was unprecedented. This is an unprecedented situation, which we've never faced before, which requires unprecedented measures. So the unprecedented situation was this terrible killer virus, which had an infection rate and a mortality or fatality rate never seen before, and requiring emergency measures which we've never used before. I wrote, as a historian, I'm always very suspicious of this term unprecedented, because if anyone reads history, there are very, very, very few things which are new. And surely enough, this virus, through the kind of research that a lot of people have done on it, is not unprecedented in its infection rates, in its ease of transmission, or certainly in its fatality rate. In fact, it's about as severe in the UK as a sort of a bad season of influenza. And that's accepting the number of deaths which have been attributed to COVID-19 on very, very tenuous and deliberately inaccurate criteria, the PCR test being the obvious one of those. The other thing which is not unprecedented is the use of emergency powers to suspend civil liberties and human rights during a crisis. This has got a long history, and certainly in Europe, Germany and Italy and France and in the UK. Up until very recent times, really. It was used even in the UK in the 70s. What we've done in the UK, we haven't actually declared a state of emergency. We've merely gone into an emergency period which is in the government's power to continue to, as it is now, in perpetuity for as long as it wants. Under these emergency powers in the UK now, for the last 15 months, we have, and this is talking very technically, accurately, we're living in a constitutional dictatorship. Our laws are made, the regulations, the coronavirus justified regulations, which last time I looked, we had 425 or something. It's probably got more than that. They're making it kind of like a rate of 7, it's about 1 a day or something. It's an enormous wave of legislation, vast numbers of which, sort of over 80, 90 of, are about removing our rights and liberties, have been made completely outside of any oversight by Parliament, and which have been not prepared by an impact assessment or any of the effects that they're going to have. When I saw this thing about them being unprecedented, I thought they were trying to use, this very well-known doctrine of crisis. Over the last few years, everything has been a crisis. It's an environmental crisis. There's a housing crisis. There's a crisis of crime. There's a crisis of population, blah, 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 blah. And crisis, the discourse of crisis, I'm sure you know, because it's kind of a very well-known one now, makes the population accept extreme measures to address the crisis. It's a fear mechanism. And people go, oh my God, we're facing something terrible. The government goes, hey, it's okay. We've got a way to address this. And then they bring in inevitably extreme measures which capitalize on that crisis. And this seemed to me, having studied the crisis of housing affordability in the UK and sort of studied it around the world, I realized there was a kind of repetition of this mechanism. One of the things that's actually emerged over the last year, I think a lot of people knew about this before, but I didn't because I've never looked into this kind of area, is that a lot of organizations, not just governments, but other private bodies, both medical and non-medical, have been preparing for a viral pandemic for many, many years. There's various books published long before this and being published since this crisis started, which have exposed, and we found out, lots of organizations, including those who are not actually medical and certainly not governmental, the obvious one being the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have developed scenarios of how to respond to a viral pandemic. And that shows that the response of the governments, particularly in liberal democracies, Western democracies, whatever you want to call them, in capitalist countries, part of the homogeneity of that response is because that response has been in the pipeline for a very, very long time. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, obviously that's something that we're facing in the world. There's a huge population of people. We live in a global world in which viruses can, because of movement and stuff, get passed around the world very quickly. And therefore, it's very good that these governments had these reactions in place. But you could look at it from another point of view and go, actually, this virus is nothing like the way that they're characterizing it. It's not something that presents a threat to most people in the world. It's dangerous. It's fatal, if you like, to people who are generally over 70 and have serious medical conditions, heart disease, dementia, etc., etc. What that suggests, though, is that when this virus came along, the organizations who had invested in this, both political, financial, saw an opportunity to put into action very well-developed responses, whose ultimate aim is to move us out of the liberal democracies that we have been living with. I'm putting both those terms in very big quotation marks, both liberal and democracies. They're certainly neoliberal. I wouldn't say they're anything like democratic, but they look like kind of dreamlands compared to what we're in now, into what we're going into now, which is a global biosecurity state, which is definitely not global in the sense that a lot of other countries are not really going along with this. But the G8, if you like, the big, most powerful economic countries in Western capitalism, obviously leaving out more powerful countries like, India and obviously China and so on, have all homogenized and collaborated in affecting this transition into something else. So I guess that's the way I see it in the big term, the macro term, the big context of what's going on. And I think that accords with the way that Western capitalism has responded to a whole series of crises, which we've seen are honestly invented, but happen over the last, let's say, 20 years, just have a cutoff, whether it's the 9/11, as you call it, which became a justification for the complete erasure of so many of our human rights and liberties and the building of the security state. If you want to travel now, It's actually unrecognizable to what travel used to be before that. More recently, the environmental crisis has become a kind of a justification for a sort of a Green New Deal for capitalism. The housing crisis, which was created kind of as a consequence of the financial crash, has become an excuse for driving up housing costs globally. So all these crises, most of which have come not really out of human error, but out of the periodic crisis to which capitalism is subject, have been used to re-entrench governmental power and particularly corporate power more firmly in our societies. And I don't see this as being any different, except in its degree. It's immense. It's bigger than anything I've seen before. And I think that's what makes it not merely another development in capitalism, but something, as I've tried to argue, of a watershed.
Did you call it a revolution in capitalism?
Yeah, in my article, I definitely called it that. People seem to be a little bit resistant to that. So they're more amenable to using a term like transition. But I do think I just look at the world around us. If this isn't a revolution, I don't know what is.
Maybe the reason that people are resistant to revolution is because so much of the left has seen this as a revolution against capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, you had philosophers who I kind of like Slavoj Žižek saying, hey, this is a model of the future communism. And I was like, God, he must be out of your head. I think what has been accelerated enormously and definitely is a revolution is this merger, although that's not really the right term, between public and private. We've seen this for a long time through neoliberalism, and neoliberalism's erosion of the public sector has undoubtedly prepared the way for what's going on now. One of the terms that people who are questioning this and scared of this and worried about this have used is fascism. Now, I don't like using that term myself because it's a historical term. It's about a particular moment in capitalism. It was about a particular political moment in Europe. But
how would you define fascism?
Well, in economic terms and political terms, fascism was defined by Mussolini himself as, well, this is slightly apocryphal, but generally this is a truth. It's the moment where the interests of the state and the corporate interests, you can't pass a cigarette paper between them. Now, what Mussolini meant by corporate interest is different to the kind of the global corporations now, but it was definitely about private interests using the state, that is the law and its enforcement, security services and police, to control the various organizations that might have come from a socialist or left-wing or working class perspective to look after their interests against the plundering and control of private interests. But I think what we've seen now is this isn't simply a collaboration, a public-private collaboration. The realm of the state has been completely or almost entirely outsourced to corporate bodies. So the state has become an administrative body of corporate interests, but also our relationship to corporate interests, which are now no longer within the private sphere, the power of capital to influence government bodies. They actually are now the government bodies. So we're going into a new form of governance, which I think is very close to fascism, but updated to 100 years later, where the technologies of surveillance, of control, are way, way, way beyond what Europe was looking at in the 1920s and 30s.
There's been a lot of talk about places like the World Economic Forum, and I don't think it is this incredibly, Machiavellian kind of body which is controlling the world. But if you look at what it talks about, it's very aggressively promoting a future in which governance itself, whether that's international governments or national governments or at every level, is a collaboration between public bodies and corporate bodies. And that is very much a kind of a fascist agenda. But the power of these corporate bodies is way beyond anything that it was in the 1920s or 1930s. So I'll answer, I kind of forgot your question a little bit, but...
Yeah. I think you're coming around to how this is driven by a revolution in capitalism.
Yeah, let me try and talk a bit about that. I think we are undoubtedly going through a revolution. This is the biggest event that's happened in the West, perhaps since the first industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution, there was a process of immiseration or impoverishment of the working class of the UK. We went through the industrial revolution sometime between the 1830s and sort of the 1850s, 70s. And they had to drive a primarily rural population off the land and into the cities to provide the workforce for the Industrial Revolution. And the only way they could really do that, even back then where the working class were treated even worse than they are now, was to simply impoverish them. So they had to go to the cities because it's the only place they could get work. And when they went into the cities, they weren't only fitted into this new economy, they were also subjected to new biosecurity measures, in a sense, to new forms of biopower. So the bodies of the working class were subjected to discourses of hygiene. Yeah, because when you get a lot of, you put them into the cities, there is, a much greater chance of disease. But that, again, it wasn't only about protecting them, it was also characterizing the working class as vectors of disease, as dirty, as sort of subhuman and so on. They were also subject to discourses of policing as well. You have the rise of police forces during the First Industrial Revolution. And you've also got the rise of new forms of governance of time. The idea that you go into a factory and you clock on and clock off. And every moment in the day is adjusted, not as it would be in rural societies to the sun, but to the abstract measurement of time, which is clocks and stuff. So that's just a broad sort of analogy. Something similar happening now. We can see it with this regimentation and control of the bodies of these new subjects of the state. I've already drawn attention to my movement now around the city. That's the most obvious evidence of this, is determined, or is on the cusp of being determined, of my compliance with biosecurity measures. Wearing a mask, social distancing, being injected, carrying a phone, and so on. There is an enormous change that is going on in the economy as well. Small businesses in the UK, tens of thousands of small businesses, and in the future, be hundreds of thousands, are going into bankruptcy. Obviously, who's going to pick up that market share is going to be the very large corporation. Everybody knows that the billionaires and the biggest corporations have got enormously rich on this. I think last year, the wealth of the 1,000 richest people in the world increased more than it ever has in human history. And this is during lockdown, when everyone else is suffering. But we're not just simply seeing this rapid increase in wealth, we're seeing a change in the nature of business itself. Since the First Industrial Revolution, capitalism has been based on the infinite expansion of production. Every year, the economy grows. That's sort of coming to an end. The levels of production in the world had reached some sort of watershed. There simply isn't the consuming power of people. We can't really buy any more. So the global battle now is not simply between competing corporations and countries to expand their economies infinitely, but to get hold of the finite resources and capabilities of the environment for capitalism. There are estimates that, what is it now, something like 9 in 10 British workers will have to retrain over the next 20 years. That's predicated on an enormous number of workers basically not having a job, being unemployed, being impoverished, being in a really, really bad state. When furlough and the government's support for people who've been out of work for 18 months or 15 months or something is withdrawn. When that happens, you're going to have a huge workforce who are waiting to be redeployed. That's the term that Klaus Schwab, and our own health minister, Matt Hancock, says. The fourth industrial revolution is not about unemployment, it's about redeployment of the workforce. That's what industrial revolutions are always about. The digital revolution and so on. It's about redeploying the workforce into new jobs, new markets, new functions, and so on. And that new market is not going to be about the infinite expansion of production, because the world can't sustain that anymore. It's going to be about something else. I'm not an economist, so I don't really want to speculate on that. But I imagine a lot of those jobs are going to be digital jobs. They're going to be about what you kind of talked about in some of your podcasts, about the vast increase that the capabilities of digital records, of digitalization, of the kind of, they talk about quantum computing now. That's going to be put in the service of running this biosecurity state, in which the vast amount of people on the planet, that's even in liberal democracies, let alone the poorer countries in the world, which is, of course, most of the world, they're going to see their standard of living drop enormously, hugely, vastly. And to manage that, you're going to need very, very powerful forms of surveillance, monitoring, and control. And that ultimately, I think, is what the biosecurity state is about. It's about dealing with the fallout from it. And that's what we're going to be coming up to probably next year or the end of this year, I think. These are speculations. I hate sounding apocalyptic because there's enough of that going around. I'm just trying to understand where this is going. I don't believe something which the left, I think, very, very stupidly thinks that the people, at least responsible for the response to this virus, which I don't think is a very good way of framing this, don't know what they're doing. Politicians may look like idiots, and some of them may be. I'm sure many of them are. They certainly are in the UK. But the people running these corporations, they are not idiots. They are definitely not idiots. And they're taking their time overseeing what is very clearly to me a revolution. And like a lot of people, I don't believe that Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and all this are philanthropists. I don't think they're trying to make, these kind of dreams that they write about in the prefaces to things about this brave new world that we're going into. I don't believe that at all. I think the immiseration of the population, which is already happening and is going to increase enormously once furlough and government support is withdrawn, they're going to use that. They're going to do what capitalism always does, which is capitalize on this. They're going to be dealing with an enormous number of people, hundreds of millions of people, whose standard of living is going to drop through the floor. Like not since the last industrial revolution, I guess. Certainly the first industrial revolution. And they're going to have to manage those people. And this is what this is about.
So here's my question. How would you explain to someone who says to you, are you saying that this is all planned out for the effect of moving us there? A lot of people are very uncomfortable with talking about what's going on outside of it being a bad reaction to the pandemic because they are afraid that this is going to make them, I suppose, come up with unsubstantiated conspiracies.
I don't think this is planned. I think there were definitely preparations. It's quite apparent that a lot of governments and global corporations who've got absolutely nothing to do with medical responses have anticipated and put in place protocols for responding to a viral pandemic. Yeah, that's a fact. That doesn't mean that they conspired to make this happen. I think, earlier on you sort of said what is a Marxist response, or as I like to call it, historical materialist response. Historical materialism means that the driving force of history is the economy, to put it in very basic terms. Yeah, material necessities of life. I don't believe that the world is run by a conspiracy of very powerful people who get down and decide, hey, we're going to have a pandemic. We're going to come and invent this thing. And then we're going to kind of, wrap people up in this terrible thing called the biosecurity state. That's not the way the world works. It's not the way capitalism works. It hasn't for a very long time. You might be able to do that maybe when we lived into a feudal society, when there was kind of a really strong top-down. That isn't to say, however, that the governments of the world and the corporations of the world and their boards don't behave like that. I think they definitely behave like that, but that's not the way the world works. One thing I've observed, and not me alone, but I think I've been most angry at, is the way that in the UK we don't actually have as harsh or severe restrictions as they do in other countries. My friend who's in the south of France says in France, you're not legally to go outside without a mask on. We haven't done that here. In Australia, my sister-in-law told me that they're under curfew, that they've only just been allowed to go from 5 kilometres from their house to 10 kilometres to their house. Australia's official death toll from COVID-19, it's under what they get killed on the roads every year. It's kind of lunacy. So even though we've actually got officially, let's put these figures in inverted commas, one of the higher death rates, essentially, to the population in the UK, we've actually got quite relatively, I say this relatively because there's nothing light about what we're doing, but we've got relatively lighter restrictions to places like Germany or Spain or France or maybe the US. I'm not quite sure. I'm more aware of what's going on in Europe. The way that things have happened in the UK is we're kind of a bit more suspicious of authoritarian governments over here. We don't have social revolutions. We haven't had one for a very, very long time. We like to think we live in kind of a liberal world. But the way that the government's done it is they haven't come down like a ton of bricks with top-down legislation. They've done a lot compared to anything we've seen before, it is. But they haven't actually gone to making masks mandatory every time you leave the home. They haven't yet injected kids. The policing has been appalling, but it's been nothing like what we've seen in Germany or Australia or Denmark, recently, where you got water cannons and stuff like this going on. What it's done is it's relied on business. Napoleon once said the English are a nation of shopkeepers, and we are. We do things not through legislation, we do it through business. But what has been done is through threats and through incentives, financial incentives, the government or the state has relied on civic society to implement this transition. And I believe that's something about the way that capitalism works. If business wasn't able to capitalize on this, if people weren't able to capitalize on this, this would never have happened. Let's put this in a class kind of basis, because I know you're kind of interested in this. If the middle classes hadn't collaborated with this, if the teachers and the lecturers, the doctors, the nurses, the business people, the civil servants, the media, if the middle classes who implement the governance of the ruling class had put up any resistance to this, we wouldn't be where we are now. If they put up a lot of resistance, it wouldn't have happened. Because the world is not ruled by individual conspiracies, even if they're immensely powerful as they are. But capitalism doesn't work that way. It needs the collaboration of the middle classes. It needs collaboration of businesses. It needs collaboration of civil society. It needs collaboration of the people who run the state. And that makes up a huge number of people. And that's why I don't believe that it's a conspiracy. I think it's not that I don't believe it. I think it's a bad way to understand what's going on. This isn't a conspiracy of evil people who look like Klaus Schwab with his strange kind of Star Trek outfits that he wears and his bald head, his kind of James Bond villain. Sort of like, yes, now we are going to take over the world. If it was as easy to do that, other much more powerful people would have done that before. Much more powerful people. That's not the way the world is. The world is in contention. It's worked because there has been a collaboration across society. And what we've seen, especially in the UK, I don't know if it's like this everywhere else, I imagine it is, because capitalism is fairly similar across Western neoliberal democracies, is that the middle classes, they've recognized a chance to capitalize on this. The same way that the digital revolution, you could look at the carrying of mobile phones and say, wow, what is this doing to our kids? What is this doing to us? What is this doing to alienate us and all that? Or you can say, wow, I can make a lot of money out of this. One of the articles I did try and document over a period of nearly 2 weeks, there are a number of offers that we got, our company, Architects for Social Housing, which was a very small community interest company. And we had something like 50 other companies writing to us saying, making pitches for business based on coronavirus regulations and legislation. It's an opportunity to move into different types of markets, to open up different markets, to promote new types of products. But above that collaboration, there is intentionality. And there is, if you like, conspiracy of far more powerful corporations and governments who can see in this how to immensely expand not just their wealth, but their power and their control over global resources as well.
Why are they never satisfied?
Yeah, I get asked questions like this a lot. I don't try to speculate on people's motivations.
Well,
yeah, of course I do that, but I guess maybe the things I'm more interested in trying to understand is how it is that notionally secular, liberal, so-called populations of fairly wealthy, comfortable, and educated nations have so easily handed over their rights and freedoms to what should be quite obviously an attempt at tyranny, if you like, if you want to call it in those words. How people who, in the UK, everything that's happened in this country through various governments go back to, say, the Iraq War, just to have a little cut-off point. But you can go way back further than that. Everything we've done, the Iraq War, the imprisonment of Julian Assange, the fiscal austerity, which, the financial crisis, the housing crisis, all this sort of stuff, we all know that it's been done on a pack of lies. We know that our press has lied to us repeatedly over and over again. I'm not talking about little lies, I'm talking about really big lies. The lies that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and stuff like this. Suddenly, believe everything the papers say. That's something that I find really requires, I'm trying to understand how that has happened. Because it's the collaboration. This is not a conspiracy, this is a collaboration at every level with this revolution that's happening. And I think that is something which is more important to understand than why Bill Gates wants to run the planet.
Right.
It's pretty obvious why he wants to do that, because he's a lunatic. A very dangerous man. But, that's the way powerful people operate, isn't it? But they can't do it without our collaboration. And it's their manipulation, the ability to manipulate us to believe something which is quite obviously a big pack of lies. So many of my friends, people, I've got a friend who's a senior economist at the Bank of England. I've got another friend who's doing a PhD. I've got another friend who's a senior engineer, builds vast, great stuff. And, they've all got vaxxed up and they were like, well, I think I'm going to believe this stuff. And I'm like, I can't believe, I really find that hard to understand. That's what's kind of really nagging my noggin at the moment, rather than the motivations of, the corporate leaders.
The lunatics on top. Yeah. You are frustrated when people speculate about the men in this smoke-filled room planning their big plan to take over the world, like in some kind of movie villain plot.
Yeah.
What do you feel gets lost when we focus on the people with money who have outsized amount of power to shift things into a way that benefits them?
Let me say from the start, because this does seem to sort of upset people. As I said before, and I've said again, I have no doubt that the people in these organizations, there's many of them, and they're becoming increasingly lacking in transparency, in accountability. Nobody knows what on earth these organizations are going on, and they are basically taking over our governance. So if you want to call that a conspiracy, you're getting an argument from me. I think, what is the G8, if not an conspiracy? What is a government? What is a cabinet, except a conspiracy to increase the power and the wealth of the people it represents? If you want to call that a conspiracy, I don't really like the term. That is the nature of power. That's the nature of governance. You've kind of got this ludicrous situation now where anyone attributes any kind of intentionality to any organization or body is now denounced as a conspiracy theorist. This is one of the things that conspiracy theory does. Its function within our culture is to reduce what should be rational debates based on evidence of the influence of powerful corporations or governments or unelected bodies, of which there are an increasing amount, sort of ridiculous debate about whether you're a conspiracy theory or not. I think that's part of the function of it. But I think there's something else about it as well, and that is it kind of evacuates our agency. Because we don't live in a feudal society, because we do live in a capitalist system, this movement into a biosecurity state, this vast increase in corporate power, relies on us to collaborate with it. And yes, we are obviously subject to, a vastly increased power of media manipulation, of, what people call psyops and stuff like that. You can see that all around you. This has been the biggest propaganda campaign I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like this. So we have been subject to that, but we still have agency. And I think it's very important that we don't attribute these godlike powers to these bodies, which are definitely conspiring to increase their power. But that's not the way the world works. We do still have agency. In a very simple way, if everyone took off their masks tomorrow and doesn't wear them, mask mandates will be dropped. If everyone refuses to take the vaccine, it can't be made compulsory. If everyone takes their kids out of the schools and says, we're not going to put them back in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, we do have control. There are not enough police in the world, even in our world, to impose a dictatorship. It happens, as all dictatorships have always happened, with the collaboration of the people. And it's very important to remember that. And conspiracy theories are so popular because they have been promoted as the model of how we understand power. And they serve the power which they pretend to be exposing. They're not exposing it, they're reinforcing it. I'm sure, like me, I imagine every time we talk to people about what's going on, even if they think the government's lying to them, even if they think the virus is not this killer thing which we will have to protect from, even if they don't believe in masks and they don't want to get injected, they all say the same thing. Not all of them, but a lot of them say, what can you do? We don't have any power. We can't do anything. They're too powerful. That is the ultimate, and I would say the primary function of conspiracies, which is to make us feel powerless. And that's why we have these, they're not comedy villains, they are villains, like Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, blah, blah, blah. They are appalling, monstrous people, but they don't run the world. What they do run, what they do have power over, is of this vast state apparatus that convinces us that we don't have any power. And I think that's a very fundamental distinction, which we got to learn really quick if we want to turn the growing opposition to this into actual political change.
Yeah. Well, there's that. But of course, the other part of the power dynamic is that there is a financial incentive for people to feel disempowered. As you talked about the middle class, I think their interest in believing that they are powerless is a big part of the problem as well.
Yeah, when this started over here in the UK, I mean, I live in a tower block in a council estate, and apparently about 80% of the residents here, well, about 90% of them are working class, about 80% of them are black, both born in England or from Africa or the Caribbean. And there's a huge number of them wear masks and look very scared and kind of social distance and stuff like that, because they've been targeted by the government by saying, if you come from a black or Asian minority ethnic background, you've got a higher percentage chance of dying from COVID-19 and all this sort of stuff. So they've been really targeted as well. And so in the beginning, I couldn't really see how the usual divisions, class divisions, race divisions, or even geographic divisions within UK society somehow allowed us to map out compliance with this growing number of coronavirus justified restrictions and regulations. But I think that's beginning to change now. One of the things I've noticed it's been really, really blatant, is that these huge marches, anti-lockdown marches, anti-vax marches, anti-vaccine passport marches that we're seeing, which are attracting, 500,000 people or something, huge numbers, are overwhelmingly working class. And that division is becoming more apparent. And it seems to me the middle classes it's quite evident actually, have collaborated with this, both individually in terms of their own individual compliance with these regulations, their kind of personal choices to take the vaccine, to mask up and so on and so forth, but as middle class agents, as professionals and middle management and all that sort of stuff. So I think there is a kind of class division which is emerging, and I think that has hope in it, but there's also a lot of challenges to overcome that. But I do also show, as the point you were making, it shows that the middle classes, they administer capitalism. They have been given a financial incentive to comply with it. They've also got a class consciousness, I think, a kind of an allegiance.
Yeah.
These people are, if they're not themselves, their parents were doctors, they were teachers, they were lecturers, they were in the media or are in the media. These are their industries. My partner, Geraldine Denning, who's the co-founder of ASH, Architects of Social Housing, she also teaches in architecture at Leicester University. And last year, when the university was really putting pressure on her to become a kind of a policeman and to make sure that students were wearing masks in class, were observing social distancing, and also was signing up to a kind of a pilot testing, lateral flow antigen testing pilot, which had been introduced into Leicester University. It was kind of, they were chosen, the university was tested. And she said, I'm not doing any of these things. And we kind of wrote up together a kind of a letter, which we sent around to every student in her department, but also every teacher, fellow lecturer in the university, or maybe in the architectural school, of which there were about 100. She sent this to 100 of her, she didn't know all of them, but there are 100 lecturers in the School of Architecture, and not a single one wrote back to her, responded at all.
Wow.
And that was
not even an acknowledgement.
There's fear of losing your job, but there's also there's a lot of incentives. There is allegiance to your class, which people pretend doesn't exist. It's absolutely ridiculous. I think this has really shown how much class allegiance is being employed to push this thing through.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to lose their job, because otherwise they might fall out of being a professional, blah blah blah. And I think again that shows that this is a crisis not in health, but in capitalism itself. And there is a redeployment of people into the roles that they're going to play in this new emerging, not merely form of governments, but this new stage, this new moment, if you like, within capitalism.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the class and the diversity, there's a great cross-section of people who have tried to push back.
Yeah.
Something that strikes me in your writing is you often write about conservative identity politics. Am I right?
Yes.
In you using that phrase, which I think to most people would be an oxymoron because they think of identity politics as the opposite of conservative.
I call it radical conservatism.
Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, that's the oxymoron, radical conservative. Radical means, it comes from the Latin root radox, which means to the root. So if you're a radical, you're someone who goes back to the root of things. Yeah. But this is usually equated with the radicals within British political history were a branch of the Liberal Party. They had no intention of, they didn't have any sort of socialist project, and they certainly didn't want to overthrow Parliament. They wanted to simply go back to the roots of, I guess, political agency and political representation and so on. And they wanted to kind of reform Parliament. They certainly didn't want to overthrow it. So what we now think of as a radical project, it becomes equated with something like, I don't know, maybe anarchism or socialism or some kind of fundamental change. That's not at all what radicalism is. I think identity politics is radical in the sense it wants to go back and question the premises on which a lot of things are based, whether that's gender, race, power, representation, image politics, gender politics, etc., etc. But I think what it's doing is it's incredibly conservative in its proposals. It seems to be almost entirely divorced from understanding the economic structures through which, for instance, to take one, racism is continued.
Yeah.
The proposal it makes, but they don't seem to, are almost all about increasing surveillance, increasing punishments, increasing the power of the state to issue fines and lock people up and so on and so forth. It's kind of a slightly separate project, but we're sort of seeing at the moment now, the powers of the state to survey us and to punish us if we step out of line, not just with laws, but with government ideology. So if I try to question anything about coronavirus justified regulations, I am, this, anything that doesn't go with WHO regulations or the government regulations on this stuff is considered dangerous to people, and therefore I'm a risk. So I get censored at best and maybe get arrested or something. I mean, one of the questions you asked here is like, how are we coping? We had some good news this week, our organization, because over the last 6 months, particularly over the last few months, our organization has been under investigation by the Architects Registration Board.
For?
Comments, writings, my writings in particular.
What?
And they were threatening Geraldine, who's our lead architect, they said that we had brought the profession into disrepute, and therefore she was threatened with a whole lot of punishments, going from a fine of a few £1,000s to suspension for a few years, to actually losing her license as an architect, never being able to practice again. And this is an example of how the institutions, the professions themselves, the middle-class professions and the institutions of the state have been implementing this censorship. Now, that is something, yesterday I went to the launch of this book, The People's Lockdown Inquirer, which I contributed something on the effects of lockdown on housing. We had a launch yesterday. Now, one of the people at it had written about the effects of lockdown on kind of education generally, but also specifically about lecturers. And, I kind of talked to him about what my partner has to go through. She's being asked to police students. She herself went in and, she said to the room of students, anyone who doesn't wear a mask can take it off because I don't care. You don't do it for me. Do it if you feel happy doing this. So the whole room took it off except one person who said, actually, I'd like to keep it off. I said, that's fine. It's okay. Nobody else has to do it. And then the next day she was called in by her, not her head of department because they don't exist anymore, by her line manager. And she was told that she had been observed, doing this and questioned why and stuff. So there's an enormous amount of censorship here. And this guy I was talking to yesterday was sort of saying how it's actually about identity politics. That, universities now, you have to sign up to all these different courses on unconscious bias and, what's it called? Radical race theories, all this sort of stuff. And you don't have a choice on it. This is now official ideology. And this is being done in the guise of protecting people, or protecting minorities, or protecting women, or protecting kids, or protecting all these things which are good, but this is not what it's doing.
Yeah.
What it's actually doing is censoring and punishing dissent or disagreement or debate, fundamentally debate. And that's why I think the ideology of identity politics, which is a radical conservatism, has prepared the ground for the extraordinary level of censorship and punitive measures which are being posed on a similar justification, which is now not protecting us from racists or rapists or child molesters or just bad lecturers. It's protecting us from this killer disease. And on that justification, anything can be done. So I do think the radical conservatism of identity politics not to mention the way it's being kind of pursued in this kind of, on social media and so on, has prepared the way.
Punitive.
Yeah, has prepared the way for what's going on now. This complete suppression of any debate. If I question anything about coronavirus, I'm endangering lives. People have written to me and said, you should be locked up. That's the nice ones. People have got a lot worse than me. So I'm very, very, very against identity politics. I don't teach anymore, but I wouldn't be able to teach now, I don't think. I was a Marxist and a feminist, and I don't think I could be either of those now.
You didn't change. They changed the definition of these terms.
Yeah, it's very, very...
What happened to your investigation?
Oh, yes. Yeah, there is some good news. When we first got told about this, we were like, it's just a bunch of, Twitter trolls moaning about us, blah, blah, blah. And we kind of brushed it off. And eventually they kind of wrote to us and said, we're thinking of putting you up for a tribunal, which... and, we were really scared. And, because it would basically mean the end of our company and very, a lot worse than that. So I wrote a very big, long response refuting what they were doing. But something really good happened. Generally, the legal profession has been... There are some exceptions. There's quite a number of exceptions. But the legal profession has been very silent about what's been going on in the UK. But there are a few lawyers, and we contacted a lawyer called Francis Hoare, Hoar, who is a barrister, and he's been fantastic in defending people with other lawyers as well against all sorts of stuff. I think he collaborated with an organization which was trying to defend a mother who was really concerned about the psychological effects of imposing masks on her, I think, young daughter of sort of 9 or 6 or something like that in school. And this has now become a kind of a template for people sort of challenging this bullying. I'm not saying you have to wear the mask at school, but bullying kids into doing it. Anyway, we contacted him and he very, very generously offered up his time because, lawyers' fees are not something that we can afford. And he wrote this extraordinary response to them. And he made a fundamental point, which was, we don't have a constitution in England, but our constitution is constituted by legal case law. And he kind of produced this enormous document, which was about free speech. And it was basically defending my fears that I've expressed in my articles and online statements and stuff, that there are comparisons between the erasure and censorship that we're facing and previous authoritarian regimes. And he wrote this amazing document. I'm actually about to publish this on the ASH website. Is that offending people is not only contrary to human rights, it's actually the basis of free speech. That the right to offend someone, for that person not to imprison you or strike you or, want to hurt you or to shout you down or be able to censor you, is the very basis of free speech and liberal democracies. And that's something which the radical conservatism of identity politics has tried to erase over the last 20 whatever years, when saying if you offend someone, you don't have the right to do that. He actually kind of inverted this. And I'm actually going to publish this because I think what happened to us, we're very, very lucky. So I haven't got around to the good bit yet, have I? The good bit is, in response to all this, last week, we actually only discovered this week because they sent it to the wrong email address, we told that they've dropped the investigation. So we're okay.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Very good news. It's probably the only good news we've had in about a year and a half. But,
are you feeling relieved?
Yes. My partner's very relieved. Yeah,
it was very stressful for her.
Very, very stressful. But that's part of what this is about. This is what trolling and harassment and threats is about. It takes up a huge amount of your energy. It's very, very unpleasant. And a lot of people say, I don't want to do this again. I don't want to go through this.
Yeah.
The censorship that we're facing, those of us who are not complying with the biosecurity state, doesn't only come from law, doesn't only come from regulations, it doesn't only come from the police and the law courts and legislation. It comes from the culture which has allowed that to be put in place. Mm-hmm. And I think identity politics has been absolutely crucial, germane, in creating a cultural environment, atmosphere, of course facilitated by technology like social media, in which these outrageous censorships of our fundamental rights, our rights of movement, of assembly, of freedom of speech, of freedom of belief, freedom of philosophical ideas, of conscience and so on, are being repressed on the justification that we are causing someone else offense or threatening them in some way. So I'm going to publish this because other people will take courage from it and also, maybe be able to use it and say, actually,
template.
There's a lawyer here. This is case law saying, I've got a right to offend you. As long as I don't incite violence against you or danger in any way, you taking offense from something I say is not your right to therefore tell me to shut up. And I think a lot of this is going to be about all sorts of freedoms, with freedom of speech, the ability to say that this is a lie, to say that this is wrong, to talk about and expose the damage of lockdown and all everything else that's going on is going to be a fundamental right that we're going to have to defend, to claw over the next few years.
And it's not going to be easy because there's been such a hyperbolic and emotionally laden. Yeah. Well,
sorry, go on.
I was going to wrap up because I took way too much of your time. But did you want to add anything?
There was something going around recently where someone said people can be deceived collectively, but they have to, whatever you want to call it, come to enlightenment one by one. And I think that's what we're facing. Vast numbers of the population of the world have been mass deceived. Unfortunately, you can't mass undeceive someone. There is just a very laborious process of trying to expose this stuff, to not be afraid or coward or silenced by the enemies of reason, and to be brave and to keep speaking out. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that, and it's great to speak with you, Frieda. There's more of us. We're growing, but we've got to really support each other on this because then nobody else is on.
I think so. It gets very lonely, and I think it's very important to try. And when you see other people who are strong, it means a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed that.
All right. Have a good night.
Yeah. Thank you.